The Cuban Missile Crisis, the crisis that almost ended the world. The 13-day-long Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 probably has one of the best compromises to a conflict seen in history. Not because of the compromise itself, but because of the people who made the compromise. It's because of the fact that two countries, fearing each other's capability to destroy them, set aside their differences and saved millions from a nuclear war. That decision in 1962 to remove our missiles from Italy and Turkey if the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba was frowned upon then, but we should look up to it now. We came too close to a nuclear war in 1962, so we should try to prevent one from ever happening. In 1945, one of the biggest wars in history ended, but soon after, another one, known as the Cold War, began. Nearly 17 years into the Cold War, a huge catastrophe almost happened. This catastrophe would have been so bad that if it had happened, that the world today would be different in nearly every way. In 1962, Americans had missiles set up in Italy and Turkey. Soviet Russia, likely fearing the advantage we had over them, negotiated and set up some offensive and defensive missiles in Cuba. Those missiles had the range to destroy almost all of America. There were many people involved in the crisis, but there were three men who influenced nearly all of it. These men were John F. Kennedy, Nikita Khrushchev, and Fidel Castro. In the days before the crisis, Khrushchev had negotiated with Castro and convinced him into allowing the Soviet Union to set up some defensive and offensive missiles in Cuba in exchange for the Soviets to protect Cuba. Over in America, Kennedy had recently received photographs from a U-2 reconnaissance plane that implied Soviets were setting up missiles in Cuba. Those photographs are what started the crisis, and they are also what turned two already fearful nations into two terrified nations. When Kennedy received the photos of the missiles the Soviets had set up in Cuba, the two nations, already in a war, got themselves into an even greater conflict. The Soviets, obviously upset about the fact that Americans had found out about their missiles, proposed that they should attack America before they get attacked themselves, and continuously tried to make it seem as though there were no missiles in Cuba at all. On the other side, Americans were desperately trying to find a solution to the problem, with the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, proposing all sorts of ideas, including airstrikes, blockades, all-out invasions, and other ways to remove the missiles from Cuba. Most of the ideas were not even considered because America could not guarantee 100% destruction of all the missiles. As both governments started to anticipate an all-out nuclear war with no hope of a compromise, they became more and more fearful of what might happen next. On the third day of the crisis, the Soviet Foreign Minister, Andrei Gromyko, had a meeting with Kennedy to discuss the missiles. Gromyko assured Kennedy that the missiles were 100% defensive. Kennedy, knowing otherwise, just went along with what the minister said, giving him a warning of gravest consequence, hoping the conflict would not get worse than it already was. 2 days later, on the fifth day of the crisis, Kennedy finally decided to quarantine Cuba, making sure that everyone understood that it was a quarantine and not a blockade, since a blockade is technically an act of war. Yet another 2 days later, Kennedy decided to inform the public on national television about the situation of the crisis, talking about what the difference between offensive and defensive missiles are, how dangerous the missiles in Cuba could be, and what the government will do to try and remove the missiles. Kennedy also wrote Khrushchev a letter saying, "I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would in this nuclear age deliberately plunge the world into a war which it is crystal clear no country could win, and which could only result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world, including the aggressor." As Kennedy wrote this letter to Khrushchev, America moved to DEFCON 3. The next day, America received Organization of American States support, giving them international legitimacy. Responding to Kennedy's letter on the 24th of October, 1962, Khrushchev wrote back to Kennedy saying, "You, Mr. President, are not declaring a quarantine, but rather are setting forth an ultimatum and threatening that if we do not give in to your demands, you will use force. Consider what you are saying. And do you want to persuade me to agree to this? What would it mean to agree to these demands? It would mean guiding oneself in one's relations with other countries not by reason, but by submitting to arbitrariness. You are no longer appealing to reason, but wish to intimidate us." The U.S. later called for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. At the meeting, the Soviet ambassador denied the presence of missiles. The ambassador of America to the United Nations told the Soviet ambassador he was willing to wait till hell freezes over for the truth, as he proceeded to show the photos to the UN of the missiles in Cuba. The next day, the quarantine was ready, and the ships were either allowed to pass or forced to turn back by America. As this was happening, the Soviet missiles became operational, but a Soviet spy offered a solution, saying if the missiles were to be removed from Cuba, America must never invade Cuba. Khrushchev wrote a similar letter to Kennedy the same day. The next day, Khrushchev wrote yet another letter, adding that if the missiles were to be removed from Cuba, America must remove missiles in Turkey and Italy also. That same day, a spy plane flying over Cuba was shot down, killing the pilot, although neither side escalated in the conflict as they did not want to make it any worse. Later, the U.S. privately told Khrushchev that they would take him up on his first offer and would voluntarily remove the missiles from Italy and Turkey. Earlier in the day, a U.S. Navy ship had been dropping depth charges. One of these depth charges hit a Soviet submarine. The 3 people piloting the submarine were allowed to launch nuclear torpedoes if the 3 men on board agreed. But one man decided to wait and see what happened, effectively saving the world from a nuclear war. On the last day of the crisis, the Soviets started to remove their missiles from Cuba as they had agreed. But this made Castro furious. Castro called the Soviets cowards and said that they should not be afraid of America. Shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, America secretly removed their missiles from Italy and Turkey. America, along with the Soviet Union, also signed the Hotline Agreement and the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The Hotline Agreement allows America and the Soviet Union to quickly and efficiently communicate in case of emergency. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty prevented America and the Soviet Union from testing nuclear weapons in space, the ocean, or in the atmosphere. Because of the changes that were made after the crisis, there was a very minimal chance that a conflict would ever lead to a nuclear war, especially one without a compromise. The hotline between the 2 countries also influenced many other hotlines between many other countries, which probably prevented some wars and will continue to do so. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a very interesting period in time. The crisis also had a very interesting conflict and compromise that we could all learn from. The fact that 2 countries at war were able to prevent their war from escalating into a nuclear war and likely save the world, even though both countries would do anything to win the war they were in, is very impressive. It is important to look back on this event and realize how scary a nuclear war can be. The 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis could have ended the world, but luckily, we were able to set aside our differences and prevent it from doing so. Then, taking it one step further, we also made ways to try and prevent a nuclear war from happening for the good of the world.